Ladies and gentlemen, education begins when we question the source of our experiences. Most people are taught to believe that life happens to them, that circumstances are independent forces, and that they must react to whatever the world presents. But deeper understanding reveals something far more empowering. Life does not happen to you, it happens through you. The universe is not an external authority deciding your fate. It is a responsive system that mirrors your inner state. When you understand this principle, you begin to see clear evidence that you are creating everything you experience. Consciousness is the primary cause of all experiences, and the outer world reflects inner assumptions. This idea challenges the commonly held belief that reality exists independently of the observer and that human beings merely react to circumstances. Education in this principle begins by redefining consciousness, not as simple awareness of what is happening around us, but as the fundamental creative field from which all experiences arise. Consciousness is the knower behind every thought, perception, belief, and interpretation. Without consciousness, nothing can be experienced, named, or understood. Therefore, it is not a byproduct of reality, it is the source of reality as it is known to us. Every experience you have ever had is filtered through consciousness. Two individuals can encounter the same external event and walk away with entirely different meanings, emotions, and outcomes. This difference does not come from the event itself, but from the inner assumptions each person holds. Assumptions are silent agreements you make within yourself about how life works, how people behave, and what you deserve. These assumptions operate automatically, often below conscious awareness, yet they shape perception and behavior continuously. Because perception determines reaction, and reaction influences future events, assumptions quietly organize the structure of your life. To understand consciousness as the primary cause, one must first recognize that the outer world has no independent meaning. Meaning is assigned internally. When you look at a situation and label it as good, bad, threatening, or hopeful, you are not describing an objective truth. You are revealing an inner state. The world acts as a mirror, reflecting back the internal conclusions you habitually accept. This reflection may not be immediate, but it is consistent and lawful. Inner assumptions function like instructions given to the subconscious mind. The subconscious does not analyze or argue. It accepts what is repeatedly impressed upon it as truth. Once accepted, it seeks external confirmation. This is why life appears to prove what you believe. If someone assumes people are untrustworthy, they will unconsciously interpret neutral behaviors as signs of betrayal, respond defensively, and attract relationships that reinforce this belief. Conversely, someone who assumes cooperation and goodwill will notice opportunities for harmony and experience supportive interactions. The difference lies not in luck, but in consciousness. Educational understanding of this principle removes superstition and replaces it with clarity. Creation is not random, nor is it controlled by external forces beyond comprehension. It operates through cause and effect at the level of awareness. Consciousness selects assumptions. Assumptions shape perception. Perception influences behavior, and behavior produces outcomes. The cycle then reinforces the original assumption, unless consciously interrupted. When people say this is just how life is, they are often describing a deeply ingrained inner pattern rather than an unchangeable law of the universe. A key aspect of consciousness as cause is that it is always active. You are never not assuming something. Even doubt is an assumption. Even waiting is an assumption. Even believing that you have no control is itself a belief that produces corresponding experiences. This means that creation is happening continuously, whether one is aware of it or not. Education in this law is therefore not about learning how to create, but about learning how to create consciously. The outer world reflects inner assumptions not symbolically but practically. Financial patterns, relationship dynamics, health experiences, and personal achievements all correspond to self-concept. Self-concept is the sum total of what you believe to be true about yourself. If you see yourself as capable and deserving, you will naturally think, feel, and act in ways that align with that identity. If you see yourself as limited or overlooked, you will unconsciously restrict your choices and expectations. The universe responds to identity more than desire. Wanting something does not create it. Assuming yourself to be the person who naturally experiences it does. This understanding also explains why effort alone often fails. People may work hard, apply strategies, and follow advice, yet see inconsistent results. Effort without alignment of consciousness creates resistance. When inner assumptions contradict outer action, the deeper belief always wins. For example, someone may work tirelessly for success while internally assuming failure is inevitable. The effort exhausts them, but the assumption quietly directs outcomes. Consciousness sets the ceiling for what effort can achieve. The educational value of this principle lies in responsibility without guilt. Recognizing consciousness as cause does not mean blaming oneself for every unwanted experience. Most assumptions are inherited from culture, upbringing, and repeated emotional experiences. They were not consciously chosen. Awareness is not about judgment, it is about choice. Once a person becomes aware of an assumption, it loses its automatic power. Awareness introduces the option to revise. Revision begins internally. When you question an assumption, you weaken its influence. When you deliberately choose a new assumption and sustain it, you reprogram the subconscious. Over time, the outer world must reorganize to reflect the new inner state. This process is gradual and natural, not forced. Just as a change in temperature gradually alters the environment, a change in consciousness gradually alters experience. The mirror-like nature of reality is not meant to trap you, it is meant to teach you. The world constantly provides feedback. Every repeated pattern is information about an inner belief. Every obstacle reveals an assumption that can be examined. Every success confirms alignment. When viewed this way, life becomes an educational system rather than a battlefield. Experiences are not enemies, they are messages. Another important aspect of this keynote is that consciousness operates in the present. The subconscious does not respond to future hopes or past regrets, it responds to what is accepted as true now. When you dwell mentally in past failures or future fears, you are activating assumptions in the present moment. The outer world responds to this present state, not to what you intellectually desire. Education in this law teaches attention management, learning where you place awareness and what conclusions you repeatedly entertain. Language also plays a role in shaping assumptions. The words you use internally and externally reflect and reinforce your state of consciousness. Statements such as "this always happen to me" or "I never get ahead" are not descriptions, they are commands to the subconscious. Conscious speech is not about pretending, but about aligning language with chosen assumptions. Over time, consistent inner dialogue conditions belief. The reflective nature of reality also explains delayed results. Sometimes an assumption has been held for so long that its effects continue to appear even after awareness begins to shift. This does not mean change is not happening. It means momentum is unwinding. Education in this principle requires patience and consistency. Just as habits take time to form, they take time to dissolve. Understanding consciousness as the primary cause transforms the way you interpret life. You move from reaction to observation, from helplessness to authorship. You stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and begin asking, "What assumption is this revealing?" This shift alone reduces fear and increases clarity. The universe is no longer unpredictable, it is lawful and responsive. When this principle is fully understood, creation becomes intentional. You no longer wait for permission from circumstances. You begin with inner alignment, knowing that the outer world must follow. The universe does not initiate, it responds. It does not decide, it confirms. It does not create your experience independently of you. It reflects the consciousness you consistently occupy. Thus, consciousness being the primary cause is not a philosophical abstraction, but a practical law. It explains patterns, empowers change, and restores agency. The outer world is not separate from you. It is an extension of your inner state made visible. When you change what you assume within, the world has no option but to reflect that change. This is not belief. It is observable, repeatable, and educationally verifiable through direct experience. Imagination is a creative faculty, not fantasy. and it actively shapes reality through belief. This understanding requires a complete shift from how imagination is commonly taught and perceived. Most people are educated to see imagination as something childish, impractical, or disconnected from the real world. It is often associated with daydreaming, escapism, or idle thinking. However, when examined carefully, imagination reveals itself as one of the most powerful functions of consciousness. Every structure of human experience, personal, social, scientific, and cultural, first existed as an imagined concept before becoming a physical or observable reality. Imagination is the mind's ability to form mental images, scenarios, and identities that are not yet visible to the senses. This ability is not passive. When an imagined idea is accepted as real, it influences emotions, decisions, behaviors, and expectations. Belief is the mechanism that activates imagination. Without belief, imagination remains theoretical. With belief, it becomes creative. The difference between fantasy and creation is not the image itself, but whether the mind accepts it as a possible or natural state of being. Educationally, it is important to understand that belief is not a sudden act of will. Belief develops through repetition, familiarity, and emotional resonance. An imagined scenario that feels distant or unrealistic has little influence, but when an imagined state is repeatedly entertained and emotionally accepted, it gradually becomes part of the individual's identity. Once something is internalized as identity, the subconscious mind begins to operate from it automatically. At that point, imagination is no longer pretending. It is instructing. The creative role of imagination can be observed in everyday life. Anxiety is a clear example. When someone imagines a negative future and believes in it emotionally, the body reacts as if the imagined threat were real. Heart rate increases, muscles tense, and stress hormones are released. The body does not distinguish between an imagined event and a physical one if belief is present. This demonstrates that imagination, when believed, produces real effects. The same mechanism applies to constructive creation. Imagination shapes perception first. When you imagine yourself as successful, confident, or supported, you begin to notice evidence that aligns with that image. Opportunities that were previously invisible become apparent. People respond differently, not because they have changed, but because your behavior, tone, and expectations have shifted. Imagination alters the internal filter through which reality is interpreted. This filter determines what you notice, what you ignore, and how you respond. This process is not mystical, it is psychological and behavioral. The subconscious mind seeks consistency between inner images and outer experience. When a person holds a stable, imagined identity, their actions naturally align with it, without conscious effort. A person who imagines themselves as competent approaches tasks differently than someone who imagines themselves as inadequate. Over time, these differences in approach produce different results. The outer world then appears to confirm the original imagined state. Imagination also plays a role in decision-making. Every decision is preceded by an imagined outcome. You choose actions based on what you believe they will lead to. If your imagination is dominated by fear, you will imagine negative consequences and avoid opportunities. If your imagination is guided by confidence, you will imagine positive outcomes and take constructive risks. In both cases, imagination directs behavior long before results appear. The universe responds to imagination because imagination defines expectation. Expectation influ. NCES attention, behavior, and persistence. When you expect success, you are more likely to persist through difficulty. When you expect failure, you withdraw prematurely. The difference in results is not caused by external favor, but by internal imagery shaping consistent behavior over time. One of the most important educational insights is that imagination must be disciplined to be creative. Left unmanaged, imagination often defaults to fear-based images learned from past experiences, social conditioning, and repeated exposure to negative information. This is why many people unconsciously imagine worst-case scenarios. They are not choosing these images, they are repeating familiar patterns. Education in conscious imagination involves learning to observe, interrupt, and redirect mental imagery. Repetition is central to activating imagination creatively. An image entertained once has little effect. An image returned to daily begins to feel familiar. Familiarity reduces resistance. When an imagined state feels familiar, it feels possible. When it feels possible, belief forms naturally. Belief does not require force, it grows through consistency. This is why short, repeated sessions of constructive imagination are more effective than occasional intense effort. Emotion strengthens imagination, but emotion must be natural rather than forced. The most effective imaginative states are those that feel calm, normal, and accepted. When you imagine something and feel strain, you are reinforcing the belief that it is difficult or distant. When you imagine something and feel ease, you are signaling acceptance. The subconscious responds more strongly to calm certainty than to emotional intensity. Another important aspect is that imagination operates in the present moment. The subconscious mind does not understand future tense. When you imagine, the state must be experienced as happy.
Ning now internally.
This does not mean denying current circumstances, but it means temporarily withdrawing attention from them. During imagination, the inner experience becomes primary. Over time, this inner priority reshapes outer experience. Imagination also influences self-talk. Inner dialogue often reflects imagined scenarios. When you imagine failure, your inner dialogue becomes critical and discouraging. When you imagine success, inner dialogue becomes supportive and strategic. This shift in self-talk further reinforces belief and behavior. Imagination and inner speech work together to condition identity. The educational misuse of imagination explains many cycles of struggle. People imagine success, but immediately follow it with doubt. They imagine change, but return to familiar limitations. This oscillation prevents belief from stabilizing. Consistency, not intensity, is what allows imagination to become creative. Choosing the same inner image repeatedly, especially during moments of quiet reflection, builds mental coherence. Imagination is also the basis of learning and adaptation. Athletes visualize performance to improve skill. Professionals rehearse presentations mentally before delivering them. These practices work because the brain activates similar neural pathways during imagination as during physical action. Repeated imagination trains the nervous system, making the imagined state easier to express physically. This further demonstrates that imagination is not separate from reality. It prepares reality. When imagination is understood as creative, responsibility increases. You realize that much of what you experience began as an unconscious image accepted as true. This awareness is not meant to induce fear, but to restore choice. You cannot stop imagining, but you can choose what you imagine consistently. This choice determines direction. The universe PR. OVS. Imagination, because it responds to belief-driven identity. It does not respond to fleeting wishes or idle thoughts. It responds to stable inner images that define how a person sees themselves and life. When imagination is aligned with belief, behavior becomes congruent, perception becomes selective, and results follow naturally. Imagination is the workshop of reality. What is built there determines what appears externally. Treating imagination as fantasy leaves creation to chance. Treating imagination as creative places direction back into conscious awareness. When you educate the imagination, you educate the future. What you consistently imagine and believe today becomes the experience you live tomorrow, not because of coincidence, but because imagination, when accepted, is the very process through which reality takes form. Persistent inner states harden into facts, regardless of present circumstances. This principle explains why temporary motivation often fails, while deeply rooted beliefs continue to shape life over long periods of time. An inner state is not a single thought or fleeting emotion. It is a sustained pattern of thinking, feeling, and expecting. When a state is repeatedly occupied, it becomes familiar. What is familiar feels natural, and what feels natural is accepted as reality by the subconscious mind. Once accepted, the subconscious begins to express that state through behavior, perception, and experience. Most people underestimate the power of persistence because they focus on isolated moments rather than long-term patterns. They may have a positive thought in the morning, and a negative one in the afternoon, then wonder why nothing changes. The subconscious mind does not respond to momentary impulses, it responds to dominant patterns. A dominant inner state is like a climate, while individual thoughts are like daily weather. Climate determines the O for all environment, not isolated fluctuations. In the same way, life reflects the overall inner climate a person lives in most of the time. Present circumstances often appear convincing because they are visible and immediate. However, circumstances are always delayed effects. They are outcomes of previous assumptions and emotional patterns that have already been impressed upon the subconscious. When someone tries to change life by reacting to circumstances alone, they are addressing effects rather than causes. This is why external change without inner change is often temporary. Without a shift in the underlying state, old patterns reassert themselves. Persistence does not mean force or struggle. It means consistency of inner direction. When a person returns repeatedly to the same assumption, even gently, that assumption gains strength. Over time, it begins to feel obvious and self-evident. At that point, the subconscious treats it as a fact, not a possibility. Once an inner assumption becomes a fact internally, the outer world must reorganize to confirm it. This process explains why negative states often feel stubborn. Fear, doubt, and limitation persist not because they are true, but because they are familiar. They have been rehearsed internally through repetition. Every time a person reacts emotionally to a situation in the same way, they reinforce the same state. Over months and years, this reinforcement creates a strong inner identity. Breaking this pattern requires awareness, not suppression. Education in this principle emphasizes that circumstances do not need to change first for the inner state to change. In fact, the opposite is required. If someone waits for evidence before adopting a new state, they remain trapped in the old pattern. The new state must be assumed before it is visible. This does not mean ignoring reality, but it means refusing to let current. Appearances dictate inner conclusions. An inner state becomes persistent when it is emotionally accepted as normal. For example, someone who has struggled financially for years may feel that struggle is normal, even if it is uncomfortable. Because it feels normal, the subconscious continues to reproduce it. When that person begins to imagine ease and stability, it may initially feel unfamiliar or unrealistic. This discomfort is not a sign of failure, it is a sign that a new state is being introduced. Persistence through this unfamiliarity is what allows change to occur. The subconscious mind values consistency over truth. It does not evaluate whether an assumption is logically correct, it evaluates whether it is repeatedly reinforced. This is why people can hold beliefs that contradict evidence and still experience outcomes aligned with those beliefs. The subconscious organizes experience to maintain internal coherence. When a new state is held consistently, the subconscious seeks ways to make the outer world match it. Persistence also reshapes attention. When you occupy a state repeatedly, your attention naturally focuses on information that supports it. This selective attention further strengthens belief. Opportunities aligned with the state are noticed, while contradictory evidence is overlooked. This is not denial, it is direction. All perception is selective, and persistent inner states determine the direction of that selection. Time plays a crucial role in this process. Change often appears delayed because the old state has momentum. Just as a moving object does not stop instantly when force is removed, an established inner pattern does not dissolve immediately when attention shifts. Education in this law requires patience. Impatience often causes people to abandon a new state prematurely, returning to familiar patterns because they feel more real. Emotion is the glue that stabilizes a state. A state accompanied by calm acceptance is more powerful than one accompanied by intense effort. When people try to force change through emotional strain, they often reinforce the belief that change is difficult. A relaxed assumption held consistently is far more effective. The subconscious responds to what feels natural, not to what feels desperate. Inner dialogue is another indicator of persistent state. The stories you tell yourself daily reveal what you are consistently assuming. If your inner dialogue is repetitive and self-limiting, it indicates a stable state that will continue to express itself externally. Changing inner dialogue is not about arguing with yourself, but about gently replacing familiar narratives with new ones and returning to them repeatedly. Sleep and quiet moments are especially influential in establishing states. During these times, conscious resistance is reduced, and the subconscious is more receptive. What you dwell on during these moments often becomes reinforced. Education in this principle teaches intentional use of these periods to introduce and stabilize new assumptions. Persistent inner states also influence how others respond to you. People react not just to your words, but to your expectations and self-concept. When you expect respect, you communicate differently even without realizing it. Over time, others adjust their behavior in response. This social feedback further confirms the inner state, making it appear as though the world changed independently. The idea that states harden into facts explains why change must be lived internally before it is lived externally. You cannot visit a new state occasionally and expect lasting results. You must live there mentally. This does not require constant effort, but it does require consistency. Returning to the chosen state whenever awareness wanders is the practice. Persistence does not mean denying emotions. It means not identifying with temporary reactions. Emotions arise and pass, but the state you return to defines your direction. You can feel doubt and still choose to return to confidence. You can experience fear and still reoccupy trust. What matters is not the absence of negative emotion, but the state you persist in overall. Education in this principle transforms frustration into understanding. When results are delayed, you no longer assume failure. You recognize the process at work. This understanding reduces anxiety and increases stability. You stop chasing results and focus on alignment. Persistent inner states harden into facts because reality is structured to reflect internal consistency. The universe does not respond to wishes, it responds to identity. Identity is formed through repetition. When you consistently assume a state, live from it, and return to it regardless of appearances, the world must eventually conform. Circumstances may resist temporarily, but they cannot override a stable inner reality. This principle empowers deliberate creation. It teaches that change is not about dramatic moments, but about daily mental habits. What you repeatedly accept as true becomes what you repeatedly experience. When you understand this, patience replaces desperation, discipline replaces force, and confidence replaces doubt. The facts of your life become the visible imprint of the states you have chosen to persist in. Feeling and assumption are more powerful than effort or forceful action. This principle corrects one of the most common misunderstandings in personal development and education: the belief that struggle, constant action, and external effort alone create results. While action has its place, action taken without inner alignment often produces resistance, exhaustion, and inconsistent outcomes. Feeling A and the assumption operate at a deeper level than effort because they determine the direction and quality of all action before it occurs. Assumption is the mental position you occupy about what is true. It is not what you hope for, but what you quietly accept. Feeling is the emotional tone that accompanies that acceptance. Together, feeling and assumption form an inner state. This inner state directs behavior automatically. When someone assumes success and feels calm confidence, they naturally act in ways that align with that assumption. When someone assumes failure and feels anxiety, their actions reflect hesitation, avoidance, or overcompensation. The difference in results comes not from the amount of effort, but from the inner state guiding that effort. Effort often becomes forceful when it is driven by doubt. When people do not trust their inner state, they try to compensate with excessive action. This creates tension. Tension signals to the subconscious that something is wrong or missing. In contrast, aligned feeling signals completeness. When you feel that something is already resolved internally, your actions become more efficient, intuitive, and effective. You do not rush or strain, you respond appropriately. Education in this principle reveals that effort is an effect, not a cause. The cause lies in assumption. A person who assumes they are capable will take action naturally, without needing motivation. A person who assumes they are inadequate will need constant external pressure to act. Even when they do act, the underlying assumption weakens the outcome. This explains why two people can put in similar effort and achieve different results. Their assumptions determine how effort is applied and sustained. Feeling is the bridge between assumption and manifestation. The subconscious mind responds to feeling more than words. You can say affirmations repeatedly, but if feeling contradicts the statement, the feeling dominates. Feeling gives assumption its reality. This does not mean forcing emotion. Forced emotion creates strain and reinforces lack. Effective feeling is subtle and natural, like the quiet satisfaction of knowing something is settled. Forceful action often comes from impatience. Impatience arises when there is a mismatch between desire and assumption. You want something but do not assume it is yours. This gap creates urgency and pressure. Pressure leads to reactive behavior rather than deliberate choice. When assumption aligns with desire, urgency dissolves. You act when action is appropriate, not when anxiety demands it. The educational value of this principle is seen in how learning occurs. Students who assume they are capable approach learning with curiosity and persistence. Students who assume they are bad at learning may study harder, but with stress and self-doubt. Despite effort, their results often suffer. The difference is not intelligence or time spent, but feeling and assumption shaping mental performance. Assumption also influences how challenges are interpreted. When you assume growth, obstacles are seen as feedback. When you assume limitation, obstacles are seen as confirmation of failure. In both cases, the same event produces different effects. Effort applied from a growth-based assumption leads to adaptation. Effort applied from a limitation-based assumption leads to burnout. This principle does not dismiss action, it reorders it. Action becomes a natural extension of inner alignment, rather than a desperate attempt to change circumstances. When assumption is clear, action feels obvious. You know what to do and when to do it. This reduces wasted effort. Many people exhaust themselves not because life is demanding, but because they are acting from confusion. Feeling also influences how long you can sustain effort. When effort is driven by fear, it drains energy quickly. When effort is driven by confidence, it becomes sustainable. This is why people can work long hours on something they believe in without exhaustion, while even small tasks feel overwhelming when self-doubt is present. Feeling determines energy availability. Another important aspect is that forceful action often reinforces the belief that something is difficult to obtain. When you struggle excessively, you teach the subconscious that success requires struggle. This assumption then reproduces struggle. In contrast, when you act from ease, you teach the subconscious that success is natural. This assumption produces smoother outcomes. The role of assumption is especially visible in relationships. Someone who assumes they are valued behaves differently than someone who assumes they must earn love. The first acts authentically and attracts respect. The second overextends, overcompensates, and often experiences imbalance. Effort without aligned assumption creates dependency, not connection. Feeling also affects timing. When you feel secure, you can wait. When you feel insecure, you rush. Rushing often leads to poor decisions. This is why patience is not a personality trait, but a state of assumption. Those who assume things will work out feel no need to force outcomes. Those who doubt feel compelled to intervene constantly. Education in this principle encourages inner work before outer work. Before asking, "What should I do?" the more effective question becomes, "From what state am I acting?" This shift prevents wasted effort. It aligns intention with execution. Assumption is formed through repetition and experience. To change assumption, one must repeatedly return to a new feeling, especially during moments of quiet reflection. Over time, the new feeling becomes familiar. Once familiar, it becomes dominant. At that point, action naturally aligns without conscious control. This principle also explains why rest and reflection are productive. When you rest in a constructive assumption, you allow the subconscious to reorganize behavior and perception. Constant action without reflection keeps the old state active. Stillness allows new states to take root. Feeling and assumption do not require perfection. Doubt may arise, fear may appear, but these do not cancel progress unless they become dominant. What matters is the state you return to. Gentle persistence in a chosen feeling is more powerful than intense effort driven by fear. Feeling and assumption shape reality because they shape identity. Identity determines behavior, behavior determines results, and results reinforce identity. This loop operates automatically. When you change assumption and feeling, you interrupt the loop at its source. Understanding this principle replaces struggle with strategy. You stop trying to overpower life and begin aligning with it. You realize that the most effective action arises from clarity, not force. When feeling confirms assumption, effort becomes efficient, action becomes timely, and results become consistent. Thus, feeling and assumption are more powerful than effort because they operate at the level of cause. Effort operates at the level of effect. When cause is aligned, effect follows naturally. When cause is misaligned, no amount of force can produce lasting change. Education in this law teaches that true power lies not in how hard you push, but in how deeply you accept what you choose to be true. Repetition of inner ideas conditions the mind and programs outcomes. This principle explains how mental habits are formed and why life experiences tend to follow predictable patterns over time. The human mind is designed to learn through repetition, just as repeated physical actions develop muscle memory. Repeated thoughts and inner conversations develop psychological patterns. These patterns operate automatically, often without conscious awareness, yet they strongly influence perception, behavior, and results. From an educational perspective, the subconscious mind functions like a recording system. It accepts whatever is repeatedly presented to it as familiar and therefore true. It does not evaluate whether an idea is beneficial or harmful. It evaluates frequency and emotional consistency. The ideas that are repeated most often become dominant. Once dominant, they guide decision-making, reactions, and expectations. In this way, repetition becomes a form of mental programming. Inner ideas are not limited to deliberate affirmations. They include habitual thoughts, self-talk, imagined scenarios, and emotional reactions. For example, a person who repeatedly tells themselves, "I always mess things up," is reinforcing an identity of failure. Even if this statement is not consciously believed at first, repetition gives it weight. Over time, the mind accepts it as a description of reality. Behavior then aligns with this belief, producing mistakes or missed opportunities that appear to confirm it. Repetition works because it creates familiarity. Familiar ideas feel safe to the subconscious even when they are uncomfortable. This explains why people often remain in limiting situations. The familiar is preferred over the unknown. When a new idea is introduced, it may feel unnatural or unrealistic. This discomfort is not resistance to change itself, but resistance to unfamiliarity. Education in this principle teaches persistence beyond initial discomfort. The outcomes of repetition are not immediate. Mental programming operates gradually. Just as learning a language or skill requires practice over time, conditioning the mind requires consistent exposure to the same inner ideas. People often abandon constructive repetition too early because they expect quick results. Meanwhile, negative repetition has often been occurring for years, quietly shaping identity and outcomes. Emotion amplifies repetition. An idea repeated with emotion is absorbed more quickly than an idea repeated mechanically. Emotional reactions, especially strong ones, imprint experiences deeply. This is why emotionally charged memories are easily recalled and why emotionally charged beliefs are deeply rooted. Education in conscious repetition involves reducing emotional attachment to negative patterns and increasing emotional acceptance of constructive ones. Inner dialogue is one of the most powerful forms of repetition. The way you speak to yourself daily reinforces assumptions about your abilities and worth. This dialogue often runs automatically, shaped by past experiences and external influences. Without awareness, it continues unchecked. Conscious repetition requires listening to this dialogue and gently redirecting it. This is not about silencing thought, but about choosing which thoughts are reinforced. Visualization is another form of repetition. Repeatedly imagining the same outcome conditions the mind to expect it. When expectation is established, behavior aligns. The mind begins to anticipate success, stability, or connection, depending on what is repeatedly imagined. Over time, the imagined scenario becomes a mental reference point. Reality then appears to move toward that reference. Repetition also affects emotional regulation. When you repeatedly return to calmness during stress, calmness becomes a default response. When you repeatedly react with anxiety, anxiety becomes habitual. The mind learns from repetition what emotional state to adopt in response to events. This learning process explains why some people remain composed under pressure while others feel overwhelmed. Sleep and relaxation periods are especially influential in repetition. During these times, the subconscious is more receptive. What you dwell on before sleep often becomes reinforced. Educational application of this principle involves using these moments intentionally, not for mental rehearsal of worry, but for reinforcement of chosen ideas. Repetition does not require constant effort. In fact, excessive effort can interfere with conditioning by introducing tension. Gentle, consistent repetition is more effective. Short, repeated exposures to an idea allow the mind to absorb it naturally. Over time, the idea no longer feels forced, it feels normal. The concept of programming outcomes does not imply rigid determinism. Rather, it highlights probability. Repeated inner ideas increase the likelihood of corresponding experiences. They shape choices, influence perception, and affect persistence. T. Adhesive factors collectively determine outcomes. When people say things just keep happening to me, they are often describing the result of long-term mental conditioning. Education in this principle also clarifies why willpower alone is unreliable. Willpower requires conscious effort and quickly depletes. Repetition, on the other hand, changes automatic responses. Once a pattern is programmed, it requires little energy to maintain. This is why habits, both constructive and destructive, feel effortless once established. Changing programmed outcomes requires introducing new repetition. This does not mean fighting old ideas aggressively. Resistance often strengthens what is resisted. Instead, attention is shifted toward preferred ideas and returned to them consistently. Over time, the old pattern weakens through neglect, while the new pattern strengthens through use. Another key aspect is consistency across contexts. Repeating an idea only during formal practice, but contradicting it during daily life, slows conditioning. The mind learns from overall frequency, not isolated sessions. Alignment between formal repetition and spontaneous thought accelerates change. The educational power of repetition is also evident in skill development. Musicians, athletes, and professionals improve through deliberate practice. Mental repetition works in the same way. The mind becomes skilled at whatever it practices most. Practicing worry develops expertise in worry. Practicing confidence develops competence in confidence. Repetition also influences identity. Identity is not fixed, it is reinforced daily. The statements you repeat internally about who you are shape self-concept. When self-concept changes, behavior follows naturally. This is why lasting change occurs when repetition targets identity rather than isolated goals. The outcomes programmed through repetition eventually appear as circumstances. These circumstances then reinforce the original ideas, creating a feedback loop. Education in this principle involves breaking negative loops and creating positive ones consciously. Patience is essential. Conditioning the mind is a gradual process. Expecting immediate transformation creates frustration and interrupts repetition. Understanding the process allows persistence without pressure. Repetition of inner ideas programs outcomes because the mind learns through exposure. What you repeatedly think, imagine, and emotionally accept becomes your mental environment. That environment shapes how you move through the world and how the world responds to you. When repetition is understood and applied intentionally, it becomes a powerful educational tool. You move from unconscious conditioning to conscious direction. You no longer leave mental training to chance. By choosing what you repeat, you choose what you become, and over time, what you experience. Awareness of self-concept determines the quality and direction of life events. Self-concept is the collection of beliefs, assumptions, and emotional attitudes you hold about who you are in relation to the world. It is not defined by what you say you want, but by what you quietly accept as true about yourself. This inner identity operates continuously, shaping perception, behavior, expectations, and ultimately the experiences that unfold. Education in this principle reveals that life does not respond to desire alone, it responds to identity. Self-concept forms early through repeated experiences, social conditioning, and emotional impressions. Family dynamics, cultural messages, educational systems, and personal history all contribute to how a person sees themselves. Over time, these influences solidify into an internal narrative. This narrative becomes the lens through which life is interpreted. Once established, self-concept tends to operate automatically, guiding reactions without conscious thought. This automatic operation is why people often repeat the same life patterns even when they consciously want change. Awareness is the key factor in transformation. Without awareness, self-concept remains invisible and therefore unchallenged. People may attempt to change circumstances while leaving identity untouched. This creates temporary improvement at best. When awareness is developed, the individual begins to notice recurring themes in thought, emotion, and behavior. These patterns reveal the underlying self-concept. Awareness does not judge, it observes. Observation alone begins to weaken unconscious control. The quality of life events is determined by how a person expects to be treated and what they feel they are worthy of experiencing. Someone who identifies as capable and deserving approaches life with openness and confidence. They interpret challenges as manageable and opportunities as accessible. Someone who identifies as inadequate or unworthy approaches life defensively. They anticipate rejection or failure even when evidence is neutral. In both cases, life appears to confirm the expectation, not because the world is biased, but because behavior and perception align with identity. Direction is influenced by self-concepts through decision-making. Every decision reflects what a person believes is appropriate for them. People do not choose based on potential alone. They choose based on identity. Opportunities that conflict with self-concept are often ignored or rejected, even if they are beneficial. This explains why people sometimes sabotage success. The success threatens the existing identity, and the mind seeks consistency. Education in self-concept also clarifies emotional reactions. Emotions arise when events are interpreted through identity. Criticism may feel devastating to someone who identifies as inadequate, but irrelevant to someone who identifies as competent. Praise may feel uncomfortable to someone who does not see themselves as worthy. These emotional responses further reinforce identity, creating a self-sustaining loop. Relationships are especially influenced by self-concept. People often attract and tolerate behavior that aligns with their inner image. Someone who sees themselves as valuable expects respect and sets boundaries naturally. Someone who sees themselves as unimportant may accept neglect or imbalance. This is not conscious choice, but unconscious alignment. Awareness allows these patterns to be recognized and revised. Self-concept also affects physical and mental well-being. Stress levels, resilience, and recovery are influenced by how safe and capable a person feels internally. Someone with a stable self-concept recovers from setbacks more quickly. Someone with a fragile self-concept experiences prolonged distress. The body responds to identity as much as it responds to environment. Changing self-concept does not happen through argument or force. The subconscious does not respond to criticism. Change occurs through repeated experiences of a new identity. This begins internally through imagination, inner dialogue, and emotional acceptance. When a new self-concept is introduced, it may feel unfamiliar. This discomfort is often mistaken for inauthenticity, but it is simply unfamiliarity. Persistence allows the new identity to become familiar. Awareness plays a continuous role in this process. Each time an old pattern appears, awareness creates a choice. You can identify with the pattern or observe it and return to the chosen identity. This repeated return is what strengthens the new self-concept. Over time, the old identity weakens through lack of reinforcement. Education in this principle emphasizes that SEL concept must be general before it is specific. Rather than focusing on specific outcomes, the focus shifts to being the kind of person who naturally experiences positive outcomes. For example, instead of trying to force a specific success, one cultivates the identity of being capable, disciplined, and adaptable. This identity then expresses itself across multiple areas of life. The direction of life events changes as self-concept changes because goals, standards, and expectations shift. You aim higher, not through pressure, but through natural alignment. You leave situations that no longer match your identity without drama. You pursue opportunities that once felt out of reach with ease. Life direction becomes clearer because it aligns with who you believe yourself to be. Social feedback often confirms self-concept, but awareness prevents dependency on it. When you are aware of your identity, external validation becomes information rather than authority. Praise does not inflate, and criticism does not define. This emotional stability improves decision-making and long-term consistency. The quality of life also improves as self-concept stabilizes. Stability reduces anxiety. When you know who you are less reactive. You do not need to constantly prove or defend yourself. This calm presence influences how others respond and how situations unfold. Life feels less chaotic and more directed. Education in self-concept also addresses responsibility without blame. Recognizing the role of identity does not mean condemning past experiences. Past identity was formed through limited awareness. Awareness now introduces choice. Compassion for past versions of oneself supports change rather than resistance. Awareness of self-concept reveals that life is not random. Patterns are meaningful. Recurring events point to recurring beliefs. When these beliefs are brought into awareness, they lose their hidden power. You regain authorship. The quality of life events improves because you no longer accept experiences that contradict your chosen identity. The direction of life becomes clearer because decisions align with values and self-understanding. You stop drifting and start directing, not through control, but through clarity. This principle is educationally empowering because it places transformation within reach. You do not need to change the world directly. You need to understand and refine how you see yourself within it. When self-concept changes, life reorganizes around it naturally. Thus, awareness of self-concept determines the quality and direction of life events, because identity is the framework through which all experience is filtered. When you know who you are, life knows how to respond. The message of this entire speech is not theoretical, mystical, or abstract. It is practical and educational. Life is governed by inner causes before it ever appears as outer effects. Consciousness sets the foundation, imagination designs the pattern, persistence stabilizes the state, feeling and assumption activate creation, repetition conditions the mind, and self-concept directs the overall course of experience. Each principle works together as a single coherent system. The universe is not separate from you, nor does it act independently of your inner world. It responds with precision to what you consistently accept as true about yourself and life. Circumstances do not initiate outcomes, they confirm inner states. When you understand this, confusion gives way to clarity, and reaction gives way to responsibility. Responsibility here does not mean blame for the past, but awareness in the present. Education in these principles restores agency. You no longer wait for permission from conditions, people, or timing. You begin with alignment, choosing inner states deliberately, sustaining them patiently, and allowing life to reflect them naturally. Change no longer depends on force, struggle, or constant effort, but on consistency of awareness and identity. As these ideas are applied, evidence appears. Patterns shift, reactions soften, opportunities align, and outcomes improve, not by chance, but by law. The universe proves what you assume, confirms what you persist in, and reflects who you believe yourself to be. When inner understanding becomes stable, outer life becomes coherent. The ultimate lesson is simple yet profound. You are not here to battle reality, but to understand it. When you do, creation becomes conscious, direction becomes clear, and life becomes a mirror of intention rather than accident.